Okay, today is November 13, 2012. We've just reviewed the examination questions and the correct responses, and we're going to begin learning Unit 5, Experiencing Abuse, Disclosure, and Recantation. Now, up until now, as I said when we began tonight, we've looked at how kids develop, how they develop linguistically, how they develop sexually, how they develop cognitively, and we looked at kids in general terms. Now we're going to focus on how kids who were abused see the world around them, how their abuse impacts upon all the things that we already learned about the typical child. You know, the trauma of child abuse, specifically child sexual abuse, how does that impact all of their developmental aspects that we've already studied? And because we are thinking about how to competently interview children, how to interview children in a forensically defensible way, we need to look at how trauma, especially child sexual abuse, impacts the forensic interview process. So that's why this is called Experiencing Abuse, Disclosure, and Recantation. And we will think about both disclosure and recantation as we move through tonight's materials. Now, one of the articles that you had to read was called The Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. And that was an article written by Dr. Roland Summit in 1983. And although it's over 20 years old now, almost 30 years old, it still informs the manner in which we interview kids who may have been sexually abused. And what Summit observed in the early 1980s holds true today. Although there have been some experts who suggest that those conclusions may not be relevant in 2012, I suggest otherwise. And we'll even look at some of the modern controversy about whether Summit's observations and the observations of his contemporaries about how children experience abuse, whether they endure and whether they are still relevant to our practice today. And I will argue that they are. Although in some of your classes in this program, perhaps more than one, you've read the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. You may be familiar with it apart from your lessons here at the university. We're looking at it from a very specific perspective. We're looking at how that trauma, that specific trauma of sexual abuse, impacts on the disclosure process, impacts how and if and when kids tell about their victimization. So it's important for us, if we're going to interview kids, it's important for us to understand how sexual abuse and child abuse in general affects their recollections and their desire to express what happened to them in the past to the adults who interview them in a forensic context. The dynamics of child sexual abuse. And I just explained why I think it's important. Your readings express it this way. The dynamics help us understand the child's perspective and what their coping strategies are, how they deal with abuse. Dr. Summit's article, The Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, makes this observation about sexual abuse of children. First of all, you have to understand what this article was designed to do. This is not a diagnosis that is the child sexual abuse syndrome, the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. It's not a diagnosis. It's not something you look at, you check it off, and you draw a diagnostic conclusion. It's not a set of symptoms. Okay, it's not like going to the doctor and saying, I got a fever, I feel lethargic, my throat hurts. You know, a doctor listens to those things, he looks at the time of year, and he asks you a few more questions, and from that information deduces or comes up with a diagnosis. That's not what this is. This is an observation, a set of observations about how children, the typical child, responds to child sexual abuse. Not all kids go through this. Not all kids deal with child sexual abuse in the same way. But generally speaking, the observations that Dr. Summit made in 1983 hold true today, and they help us understand how the average child deals with sexual abuse. So we will start out with the proposition that it's not a diagnostic tool. In fact, Summit wrote this for other therapists and other psychologists who were encountering children and adult survivors who reported being sexually abused. It was among his concerns was that other doctors and other psychologists didn't understand this process. And if they were going to help children and adult survivors heal or deal with the consequences of their earlier victimizations, they ought to understand how this process works. And in the 1980s, some psychologists and social workers didn't understand how kids experienced abuse. And thus, they may have given bad advice, not helped children in a responsible and competent way. They may have, because they misunderstood what happened to the children, may have discounted certain aspects of their recollections, or just looked at what they had before them in the wrong way. So he wrote this article for other doctors and psychologists and social workers, not for prosecutors and not for cops. He wrote this for his peers, his colleagues in the psychological field. Now, Summit was a psychiatrist at UCLA. And, you know, among his patients were incest victims and survivors of childhood sexual abuse. When he wrote the article, the model that he used was father-daughter incest. But his observations are not limited to father-daughter incest. Nevertheless, when he expresses himself in this elegant article, he does it in the context of incestuous child molestation, in the context of a dad who molests a daughter. But you can look at the entire syndrome, not only in that context. I like to suggest that these dynamics can be present where there is a child who is in a subordinate relationship to an adult. Father-daughter is a great example of that. But it could be a coach, member of the team. It could be a teacher and a student. It could be an uncle and a nephew. If the child is subordinate to the adult, that means that they have to listen to what the adult says, that adult has some control over them and some authority over them. And the child has to respect that authority and listen to what that person says. Very similar dynamics can occur. And it's not only girls. It could be boys. It could be a boy and a trusted coach. It could be the parish priest. It could be someone that the child respects, someone that the child is subordinate to, someone that the child is expected to faithfully and blindly listen to, someone that the child is controlled by, legitimately controlled by. Parents are supposed to teach their kids, parent their kids, control their kids, tell them what to do. So although this is a father-daughter incest observation, it certainly can inform how we think about all kinds of abuse when the kid has to respect the authority figure, and that authority figure molests. So, what does Summit say generally? Well, he says there's a number of stages that kids go through when they're molested, and I will use his model. Having said that, it can apply in a variety of contexts. His model is father-daughter incest. So girls who are sexually abused by their dads, there are a number of stages that the typical child may go through. And he identifies them: secrecy, helplessness, entrapment and accommodation, delayed or unconvincing disclosure, and finally retraction. One way to remember that is, and that's the way we have it on the PowerPoint, is she-doctor. If you need to remember these categories that Summit suggests, one way to remember them is using the mnemonic she-doctor. Now, Summit argues that the first two, secrecy and helplessness, are preconditions. They're not really part of the stages that a kid goes through when they are molested. They're not part of the stages that a girl goes through when her father molests her. They are preconditions. They are the foundation. Without either one of them, you need both. Child molestation could not happen. So secrecy and helplessness are preconditions to incest. Let's think about that for a moment. Childhood incest happens in secret. It happens in homes. It happens in private. If it didn't happen in private and in secret, and the actions of the perpetrator were transparent, if they were obvious to third parties, you wouldn't have molestation. A precondition is, a necessary component of child molestation is that there is some secret aspect to it. That it happens in private, whether it happens in the home or in the gym or some other private place. You need secrecy. Without secrecy, there can be no sexual molestation of subordinate children. And the other precondition, the other aspect of the relationship between the child and the perpetrator that is required for there to be child molestation, the other foundational aspect is helplessness. Helplessness. Without helplessness, you couldn't have childhood incest. You couldn't have sexual molestation of children. It is the secret nature, the private nature of what happens, coupled with the helplessness of the child by definition in this relationship, that provides the basis for the molestation that follows. Okay? It's a private event that happens to a person who is helpless, unable to defend themselves. If either one's missing, you don't have molestation. Obviously, if it's out in the open, you can't have it. They'll get caught, and that's the end of it. And if you have someone that is not helpless, someone that can take care of themselves, someone that has safety options, someone that can defend themselves, then you don't have molestation. Unfortunately, within families, these are private events. You know, we walk down the street and we see many homes in our community, but we don't know what happens behind closed doors. We don't know what happens inside those homes. We don't know what happens at 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning in those bedrooms. And that makes sense because families are private. And you have a class of people, children, that are helpless. They can't defend themselves. They don't have options. So by coupling helplessness and secrecy, you have the perfect foundation for exploiting the sexual abuse victim. Yes? I do in the sense that, or some it does, that these things happen in private and in secret. They happen when the shades are drawn. They happen in a private space. They don't happen out in the open. These are not transparent. They're secret, private events. They happen in a very private context, whether it be the subject, the perpetrator, or the child. The setup, if you will, the family home is the perfect place for these things to happen. It's a very private place. It's very hard to happen in the playground. It's not secret. Now, there are a lot of aspects to this notion of secrecy. How the molester keeps it a secret, how he creates. You still have to keep it away from the wife, the siblings, and all those other things. So, the perpetrator also will create and advance the secret nature of this. But if you start out, before the perpetrator does anything, these things happen in private homes and in private spaces. And that you need privacy to do this. So secrecy and a helpless victim are two things that are necessary. If either one was not there, the guy couldn't get away with it. Does that answer your question? Is there some other aspect of it you were thinking about? Yes.
Mother was telling her, don't trust people and don't tell people your secrets, keep them to yourself. I was thinking about it more, not as a molester, but as a kid.
Yes. Tony makes the observation that in the Jane Doe narrative that we read for Learning Project 2, that the mother makes it clear to the child when the child attempts to report it that, this is nobody's business, this is our business, don't share it with anybody. And in that sad situation, the mother became complicit or involved in maintaining the secret. And that happens. And you're right, that's something that was relevant to that kid's experience. The time she tried to crack the door open a little bit on what was happening to her, the mother slammed it shut. So secrecy was maintained, and thus the molest continued. So that's an example of, and you hit on something here, of what someone's trying to say here. You need secrecy. And in this case, there, ever so slightly, there was an opening where the rest of the world could see it, and the mother wouldn't allow it to happen. So you have these preconditions, secrecy and helplessness. That's the recipe for molestation. That's the reason it can happen. And if you think about it for a minute, daughters, sons, whomever, children, by definition, are helpless. They are developing beings. If you reflect back to when you were 7 or 8 years old, or 9 or 5 or 6, your entire world is defined by your caregivers, by your parents. They tell you what time to get up, what time to go to bed, whether you can go to the school and play basketball on a Saturday afternoon, whether you can do your homework or not do your homework, whether you can stay home from school on a particular day. They control you, as parents do. They define your whole world. The child's world ends by simply looking up and looking at her caregivers. It is no more expansive than that. Things begin to change as they reach adolescence. But the school-age child is utterly and completely dependent upon their caregivers. Those caregivers define their world. Those caregivers provide them with information about what's right or wrong, what they're supposed to do and not supposed to do. And that's okay. The problem is when you have someone that's bad, when you have someone who's exploitive, when you have someone who is going to take advantage of that special and unique relationship between caregiver and child, it's a recipe for bad things. So the perpetrator can define to the child aspects of human sexuality in their own way. We are supposed to listen to our parents and not question them. And we're at a time we're just beginning to learn about stuff. And if our parent or the perpetrator parent tells us this is okay or you should do this, but mom wouldn't understand, you need to do that, who is the child to challenge that? So not only are they helpless physically, they can't run down to the police station, they don't have options for safety. And similarly, they're helpless in the sense they don't even have the cognitive capacity or life experience to even realize what's bad or good. They're helpless in fact, physically helpless in fact, but they're also psychologically and emotionally helpless. They have no one to turn to, nor do they have the life experience to evaluate the propriety of what's happening. If dad says, this is what girls do at age 8. You have to, pull on my penis and do this and do that, and it's just another part of growing up. So the adults at that time define the child's world, for good or for evil. Now, we hope that it's for good. That's okay. Parents are supposed to teach their kids. They're supposed to usher their children from grade school through their high school years and beyond. But something gets tragically distorted in the household where there's incest. So you have a kid who's helpless in a variety of ways in a very private area, and the person takes advantage of that. And because of those preconditions, because of secrecy and helplessness, the child has no options. Right? Who do you go to? The very people that nature, that God, that the world has put in your house to care for you. The very people that you go to ask questions. The very people that you go to say, keep me safe. The very persons that you go to when you have nightmares. When you face the childhood terrors that many kids face. The very people that you go to are exploited. The very person that you go to help you is the one who's molesting you. You see, something bad, you stub your toe, you have a nightmare, some kid's picking on you at school. When you're 5 or 6 or 7, who do you go to? Your parent. But when the parent is molesting, the very person who's supposed to keep you safe is abusing you, there's nowhere to go, and there's no one to turn to. Thus, you're trapped. That's entrapment. Entrapment. Because of the dynamic of childhood, children who are sexually molested have no options for safety. So what do? You can't run, you can't hide, you gotta live in the household, you gotta listen to your dad. Your dad comes in your room, he touches your body, he does things to you, and the person that you would tell that you want this to stop is the guy who's doing the stuff. So there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to hide. So you learn to cope. You learn to deal with it. And children deal with this kind of sexual molestation in a million different ways. But you got to get through the day after day. This is your world and there's no way out. So you're trapped. So you accommodate. Entrapment and accommodation. Accommodation means coping, getting used to it, figuring out how to deal with it, because you can't get out. A nice example from the past few weeks, although it's not a trauma example of accommodation, but many of us were without power for 6.5 days. We ain't used to that. But we got nowhere to go. My neighbor next door didn't have power. Down the block didn't have power. The community next door, there was nowhere to go. Now, barring buying a generator or having a generator, you had to deal with it. You had to cope, right? And you do things different. If your hot water heater was affected, you take a quick shower rather than a long shower, right? Or maybe you clean up in different ways. You have to change your routine and your way of living to deal with the circumstance. A circumstance from which there's no way around. You're stuck. Now, you don't just go jump off a bridge and say, this is terrible, I can't live in the dark. You figure out ways to cope. You get candles. People huddle together. You change your patterns. You take quick showers, right? You go to a neighbor's. You stay at work late. You do whatever it is to deal with a hand of cards that you can't change. Now, it's nowhere near what I'm talking about in the incestuous case. But it's about coping. It's about dealing with stuff that you cannot alter. So, how do kids deal with it? How do they accommodate? Well, sometimes kids, in the real terrible cases of chronic molestation, they do something called dissociation. Dissociation. Now, not all kids do this, but it's a way that kids can cope. And, I'm not a psychologist, but loosely speaking, it's when psychologically, in your brain, you go somewhere else. Okay? You avoid feelings. You avoid thinking about what's happening to you. And Sorensen and Snow give an example. I go to the pink forest. You go somewhere else. You count the little holes in the ceiling. You don't feel when Dad touches you. You simply make your brain think of other things, and you go somewhere where it's safe and where you don't experience what's actually happening. Whether it's counting the holes in the ceiling or going to some fantastic place, you are not part of this. And there's a couple things that happens. It's one way, it allows you to deal with what's going on. Okay, it allows you to get through that experience and get up the next day and sometimes lead on the surface a rather normal existence. But the other thing that could happen with some kids is they go through that experience and they're like, he's not even touching me. I'm not there. That's just my body. He can't have my soul. He can't have the way I feel. So by kind of dissociating, by stepping out of yourself, it's not you that it's happening to. Now, in fact, it is you, but that's a way to deal with it psychologically. And there's a number of different ways that kids deal with things psychologically. One of them is dissociation. You saw many of those examples in your learning project 2. How Jane Doe coped, dealt with what was happening to her, besides dissociation. There are kids, see, they're only 8, 9, 10, 11. They're little girls, and they don't really understand human sexuality. On some level, especially the older ones, maybe they're 9, 10, or 11, on a basic level, they appreciate that sexual desirability somehow factors into what men want to do with them. So if they make themselves sexually undesirable, is the equation, then maybe they won't touch me anymore. So they'll be laying around in their pajamas all day. Or they will wear baggy clothes that understates their femininity or their body parts, thinking that the less sexually desirable they are, the less likely they're going to be touched. That very rarely solves the problem, but it's one way that kids can deal with it. Again, you're stuck. There's nowhere to go, and you got to accommodate. The other thing is you'll see kids. Sometimes other lawyers, when I prosecute these cases, will go, "Oh, where's the school records?" There's no evidence that the kid was flunking school, as though simply because this is happening, all kids will do lousy in school. Some of them will. It can obviously be very distracting to be molested by your father on a weekly basis or a daily basis and try to get good grades. That intuitive belief is on the money in some cases. Some kids become overachievers. They'll take all that energy, all that anxiety, and they'll focus on whatever it is in front of them. Some kids can be very successful. You've had, look, Oprah Winfrey, Miss Americas. There are many examples of female children who were sexually victimized by their fathers who did real well in life. There are plenty of them that wound up in a bad place for the rest of their days. But there are plenty of them that are overachievers. And one way, we're talking about accommodation, one way they accommodate, one way they cope, is by putting all of their efforts into their schoolwork. And two things happen there. Number one, they remain focused. They kind of box out the world around them, and they're going to only focus on math, or only focus on geography, or history, or focus on their teachers, who's a good person, a person who cares about them. They focus on that, and it kind of makes this molest stuff take a back seat psychologically in their world. And the other thing is, they may stay late at school a lot. They may go in on weekends or work on a project or be outside the house a lot because they're a star student. And that's good. Because when I ain't home, nobody can touch me. So the kid who stays late, spends a lot of time at school, spends a lot of time at friends' houses, seems to always be working on their schoolwork and often are, that sometimes is a coping mechanism. It's a way to psychologically focus your energies on something else that keeps you from remembering and thinking about what's happening, and on another level it makes you unavailable because you're working so hard and you're at school a lot. And there are scores of ways that this happens. In Jane Doe's experience, that was due to that, correct? Yeah. So, in Jane Doe's experience, pardon me, she describes a couple of odd things she did. Someone tell me what she did just within her own environment in the household, how she rearranged things thinking that it would make her safer. Someone tell me that? Go ahead.
Did you play possum? Pretending to be asleep and it didn't work?
Yeah. Because the child doesn't appreciate that the caregiver doesn't give a damn whether they're awake or not. I mean, they're objectifying this child's body parts and they're sexually gratifying themselves, awake or sleeping. In many cases, it's, the offender doesn't care. Sometimes they do. But the child believes that if they're not engaged, if they're not involved, that he'll go away. And Jane Doe did that, and Summit writes about that, playing possum. And it happened, in fact. Go ahead.
I actually have a question about the assignment, because last week I asked about if you're going to change the dates around because of the whole thing, and if we're just starting Unit 5 today, and it's supposed to be done by the end of Unit 5, can we have like an extra day? Because I didn't do it,
Well, you need to do it, and we'll deal with your particular situation, but it was due today. I said I'd chop off stuff at the end. We'd get rid of stuff at the end. I didn't talk about changing due dates for different things, but I did change the due date to the discussion board, and I'll change any due date if someone makes a persuasive argument that they were prejudiced by any event, whether it be personal or a terrible storm. That thing's been there. People have been talking about that project for a long time now. It was available. But we'll talk about that later. You need to get it in when you get it in. You have a persuasive reason why you couldn't get it in? Well, I'll do it. I want you to do it. And I'm not going to give up too much by going. Okay, so submit it tomorrow. And there are other people who've emailed me privately, have their own circumstances. I don't want to get into it. I want to talk about how Jane Doe coped. Go ahead.
She was in the bathtub with her sister. She tried sitting on the other side, so while I took the shower, he couldn't look at her while he was going to the bathroom.
Fascinating, isn't it? Just thinking that if I put myself in a different place in the bathtub, I'll be safer. Did it work? No, it didn't work. But that's not the point. The point is, they'll go to extraordinary lengths and sometimes do simple things in order to keep themselves safe and to prevent the molester from continuing to molest. Jane Doe, by the way, is no Jane Doe. Jane Doe's a real person. Jane Doe was a woman in her 30s who, about 10 years ago, called up and wanted to make a complaint about her father molesting her. She was now an adult when she was little, consistent with what you read. And she and her siblings lived out of state. And because they're adults in their 30s, sometimes we are aggressive with people despite what they want to do. It's not their decision about whether to investigate and prosecute. But in this case, they were competent, they were a lot older, and they didn't want to go forward. They just wanted to report it, and then she wanted to not go any further with it. And we respected that. And then some years later, she calls again and wants to follow up. And we learned that her sisters were molested as well. And they were most concerned about the dad, who now had another child who was significantly different in age. These women were in their 30s. The new child was 18 or 19. And they believed that stuff had happened to her. And they felt guilty about that. And concerned about that. And then they came forward and we interviewed some of them. And the narrative that you're reading, that story, is when they walked into a municipal police department in the southern part of this country. And the police said, we do all kind of things here. We're going to take a statement, put you on video. We have social workers come in and type this, and we take a statement and all this. They told her, like NYPD Blue, they're like, here's a paper and a pen, go in the other room and tell your story. And it's, I don't begrudge them. That's, resources are resources throughout this country. I don't know how that unit works in that part of the country. And they got her story. And she was certainly confident, and she wrote it down in her own writing. There's something compelling about that. It's not something I would typically do, and that's not the way we investigate by letting the witness go in. We like to ask questions, and they may not know what's relevant or not relevant. And there's a lot of reasons why that's not ideal, but it's a way to get the story. So that woman, Jane Doe, wrote what you read. I blacked out the different parts that identified exactly who she is. She wrote that on and on, 26 or whatever pages, in response to the police saying, tell us what happened. And interestingly, there's a lot of detail in there. It's not like she had another crack at it a couple days later. I'm sure that if we took those 25, we could have 500 pages. And there are details of deviance that we never even heard about. Those pages are bad enough. We don't need to hear any more. Now, she may need to process that and therapy and all that if anything else happened or something different. But, those 25 pages, when I read that, I was like, wow, this is... And I've seen this over and over again. The reason why, in my mind, what Summit wrote nearly 30 years ago is still relevant today is because I see kids and survivors saying the same thing over and over again in my professional practice. And when I read that narrative from Jane Doe, I was like, whoa, she died. It's all in there. And she ain't the only one. I got lots of kids, hundreds, that tell similar accounts about what it was like to grow up a victim of incest. And that one just happened to be nice because it was in 25 pages and it was handwritten, which I think for students really, makes it more compelling than simply reading a statement that we police officers type up. It was coming from her own hand. And the part about her caregiver, her mother, one of the things she said to me was, because they called the second time, and, the detectives aren't all happy to open a case that's 20-something years old. But we take them, and listen, if it's a good case, it's a good case. And if it's a bad guy out there, it's a bad guy. And we're going to go after him, or her. But when they're older, they got a lot more input than a little kid in a child sexual abuse special victims unit investigation. So she says, look, I came to you 5 years ago, whenever it was. I want to follow through now. I've spoken to my sisters. Sorry. She said, don't indict my mother. And the grand jury wanted to charge her mother. And if you read that, you can understand why. So I told her I wouldn't charge her mother. But I couldn't tell her what the grand jury was going to do. I said there's a small possibility the grand jury would indict your mother. And the grand jury wanted to indict her mother. So I told the grand jury, listen, you got the authority to do whatever you want, but think about what happens here. You got an 18 and 19-year-old girl that lives in New Jersey with the mother and the father. And you need to look at this from the mother's perspective, too. even having said that, the mother made some very poor choices. And there was also evidence of spousal abuse there. And that's always a game changer. That's always a game changer. And I asked you in your discussion board to talk about and think about why, nearly 20% of mothers don't support their daughters. And sadly go out and defend the perpetrator and often come to court with them and bail them out and do everything in their power to undermine the prosecution. But that kind of stuff, when I first started doing this kind of prosecution, it was maddening. But you need to look at it from your mother's perspective, or from your perspective if you're a mother. It's a very difficult dilemma. Now, some people go, I don't give a damn, they should pay. And that's one way to look at it. But the non-offending spouse or caregiver who's put in that situation is in a terrible predicament. It's almost like that movie Sophie's Choice, although that was even more compelling. But you have a Sophie's-like choice there. And often what they do is try to handle it themselves. And I think there's some evidence of that in this case, too. Like stay out of his room, those kinds of things. But she said, don't indict my mother, and we will prosecute the case with you. I said, listen, I'll do everything in my power to do that. I need to know more about your mother and why she did or didn't do the things she did. But I think we can respect that, and I won't do anything affirmatively to charge her. I could file a complaint against her if there was evidence at any time. And I wasn't going to do that unless I discovered something terrible beyond what she told me when they first called our office. And I said, you have to commit to us now. You got to, you're living in so-and-soville. I mean, it's not easy. You got to come up. You have to be here for pretrial hearings. Anyway, long story short, they participated 100%, and he went to jail for, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years, or whatever. There was no trial. If he went to trial, he'd have died in jail. But it was better resolved through a plea bargain, and there was a plea bargain. He went to jail for a real long time, and we didn't have to tell this story in a very public forum in front of lots of strangers. And that's the prosecutor's dilemma when you prosecute these kind of cases. So Jane Doe is real. What she felt was real, and what she felt appears as if it was lifted right out of Dr. Summit's observations in the 1980s. So you have entrapment and accommodation. We talked about a couple of the accommodations that Jane Doe experienced, and there are lots of different ones. Kids accommodate and cope in a variety of ways. The next step is delayed or unconvincing disclosure. And the disclosure, the telling about what happens, usually occurs when one of the foundations has a crack in it. What do I mean by that? You get caught, it's exposed, it's no longer secret. That's one way. What else? What else could be a foundational crack? How does that happen? Okay, I know it's obvious, but we need to think about it. Yes, you grow up. You become less helpless, you become more autonomous, you become more experienced, you have more options, right? You're in a better position to express or articulate what happened, and you realize the badness or the wrongfulness of it. See, lots of these kids, especially the pre-pubertal ones, they don't know that it's bad. And it sounds beyond belief when you hear the kids say, you mean you're supposed to do that with your boyfriend, not your dad? And they may not say it as bluntly as that, sometimes they do. But that happens all the time, that awakening, that realization as they grow and as they learn more and become more emotionally, cognitively, and physically autonomous. It means more free, more understanding, more experience. When that realization happens, they begin to take an assessment of what the hell's going on. Now, what do you do about it? So even though you grow, and even though, well, guys get caught, that's the end of it, but even though you grow, or even though there's somebody maybe thinks they got caught, but he explained it away, even though these things happen, kids still don't tell for reasons. Well, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that they begin to compare and contrast everything. Because I know growing up, most little girls, it's more little girls than little boys. But Jan got to go this way, or, you know, her mom does this, her dad does this, and they start to compare their life with all the other little girls' lives, and they want to communicate, well, how do you do this, and when did you learn that? So it's more imperative that they share every one of their experiences.
Yes.
And they talk more.
Yeah, yeah. Their world is expanding. They're seeing other perspectives other than their own because they're interacting with a broader social group.
But in Jane Doe's case, it's like her mom is telling her, don't trust anybody. Like she even says in her statement that it caused her to not be able to have relationships, that she wasn't trustworthy with people. Like she didn't develop that part kind of because of, I think, obviously secrecy, helplessness, fear, and because she was told.
Exactly. And trust, that theme is very common. In fact, it is the number one reason for impaired adults. The children who experience molestation, any kind of exploitive molestation, nearly all of them has trust issues. It's just a question of degree. But even Jane Doe got to the point where she realized...
She's being told, like it's not something that she learned. Like her mom's like embedding it in
Right.
her. Don't tell, they'll turn on you.
Yes. And well, mom's reinforcing what she's learning simply by being molested. Mom's reinforcing it, and that doesn't help. But even Jane Doe was becoming a teenager, and what she accepted at 8 is now she's questioning, like all these kids do. How they react to it's a different story. And in Jane Doe's case, as you point out, the deck was stacked against her because her mother's reinforcing these negative aspects. Go ahead.
But also when she was dating her best friend talk her and do something, so that made her more afraid to talk to people.
Yeah. You can't even script this. I mean, the one little girl or person that she trusted in the world, that she wanted to open up to and get safe. See, it's about having no options, right? You're helpless. Well, she saw an option. Maybe if I tell her, and that girl did something bullying to her, and she felt everybody, you can't trust anybody. Everybody's going to betray you. Everyone's going to take advantage of you. How can I trust anybody if my friend, who I'm about to open up to, then does something mean? What happens is the secrecy and the helplessness, for a variety of reasons, begin to change. The foundation or preconditions that facilitated this incest begin to disappear and break and have cracks and change. Nevertheless, not everyone tells, but among those who do tell, because they're no longer secret, because often it stops, not always, it stops. So when they become autonomous or they become teens, they're like, yeah, I'll not stop it, or I'll tell. Now, all kinds of bad things can happen from that, but they realize that it ain't right, that they do have some options, but they don't always take advantage of those options. They say, all right, now I'm going to tell them, I'm going to go to a teacher, I'm going to go to the police. That was wrong what you did. Remember, it's their father. The older they become, the more aware that they become of life, of relationships, of families, of their position socially. It helps them understand that this is wrong and that they do have options, okay? But it also helps them understand what the outcomes might be. And the outcomes, in their world, and many times they're true, the outcomes are almost always bad and negative. How are they going to believe me? How do I tell them that it happened over and over again? They're going to think I wanted this. And there were times when I did want it. And simply because I didn't stop it, the inference that many people make is that you must have liked it. But they ignore the fact that there's helplessness. It's not that simple, but the child who is now in a position to make a statement about their abuse, to say something about their abuse, sizes up the potential outcomes. And most of the time, the outcomes are not good. First of all, they'll be ashamed and embarrassed. No one will believe them. What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to Dad? What's going to happen to Mom? What's going to happen to my siblings? What will they think of me at school? Remember, you're still dealing with a 13 or 14 or 15-year-old mind here. So even though they're capable of telling and capable of putting a stop to it, or at least attempting to put a stop to it, many of them do not. However, some of them are in a position to say no. And some of them realize that I can tell, and he knows I can tell. So what they sometimes do is leverage that. And the guy stops. Many of these cases last from 8 till 13, and it stops. For a variety of reasons, including that they could tell, they let it known to the perpetrator they're going to tell. And sometimes they will, even when this is happening, they'll bargain with the perpetrator. I want to go out to the school dance, or I want to do this, I'll tell Mom about what happened. Kids imply that I'll tell Mom about what happened. All of these things. And once you bargain, once you get Dad to give you something in exchange for sex, or once you bargain with Dad to give you something in exchange for not telling, it becomes even more difficult to disclose. Because all the things you thought about yourself, you can rationalize and say, well, it really wasn't my fault. I mean, there's two sides to that story. But once you do something that you realize is bad, it just adds to the tremendous burden and weight that's on that child's shoulders. And makes it even more difficult to tell. And when I talked about, they might say I liked it, that is confounded by the fact that they did like it at times. Like it in the sense that it felt good. But they can't separate that. We have nerve endings in our private parts. When people stimulate them, it feels good, no matter who's stimulating it. And the feelings of arousal that some kids felt when it was happening can lead to lots of conflicts about whether they should tell, whether they brought it on, or whether they were somehow complicit. When they never were. None of those things are true. But again, you have to realize how the adolescent mind's working. Anybody's mind's working. If I was aroused, sometimes kids will put themselves in this situation where it happens again because they want it to happen again. Because on some level, it's physically pleasing and arousing. And that's just the tip of the iceberg in the emotions that are going on in this child's life. Go ahead, Bruce.
What I was going to say is, you mentioned earlier how there was some evidence that, or speculation that her mother was domestic violence.
Yes.
Being physically abused. A lot of times I know, working at a halfway house, those women that had children, they were saying that, their parents were physically abused, and their father would sexually abuse them to kind of save their mother so they won't beat them. So that was a way of escaping or helping their mother so that, he won't kill her or, this and that won't go any further.
That's true. And that's another aspect of what it's like to be in that situation, especially when there's family violence. And your observation is an accurate one. It's consistent with my experience, too. You know what? He's a hothead. I don't want to make him mad, so just take it out on Mom or my siblings or the dog. And you know what? It's just... So that's where the kid... You see, if you read that article between the lines, we're going to go over it in detail next week, too. That's where the kid feels responsible for maintaining the order of the family. They become central to preventing fragmentation and chaos. In their mind. If I just do this, Dad will be happy, he won't beat up Mom, he won't do this. Because when it doesn't happen, things are intense in this household. So they begin to take the weight of the world and responsibility for the cohesion of the family. They become martyrs. And someone says that. And it's true. And it happens. And that's the way some of these kids feel. So you're right on. What you experienced or what you learned from some of your clients in the halfway house is consistent with Summit writes and with my experiences as well. So, think about it for a moment. I said some kids continue to live this, but some kids don't. Some kids do tell. Okay? That's the next stage, delayed and unconvincing disclosure. It's necessarily delayed, because they didn't tell the first time, it's always delayed, right? So, delayed is just part of incest. So it's delayed. They don't tell right away. Disclosure, this telling of it, and the reporting of it, it's delayed. But what's important here is delayed and unconvincing disclosure. I can't imagine it ever coming out in a convincing way. It is necessarily unconvincing. But there are degrees of it being unconvincing. The worst way for it to come out, and sadly, perhaps the most common way, is in the middle of familial conflict, where the mother is arguing with the child, or telling the child that she's got to do what dad says, or that she's got to go to the market with dad, or they're going to go to dad's relatives for Christmas. Usually surrounds something that the child is resistant to do with dad. Or mom somehow is saying nice things about dad. You better respect your father. He puts clothes on your back. If it wasn't for your father, this family would have fell apart a long time ago. Don't you give me lip like that and leave. You go to your room. And you're not going to the 12th grade dance. And you're not going on a school trip to Washington. It's not happening. Don't you ever speak that way about your father. And the child says, yeah, well, you think he's all that? He's an asshole. Don't you speak like that about him. He's been touching me. What? That's right. This guy that you like, he's a big shot. He's a nice guy. How'd you want to know if you found out he was raping your daughter? What? Thanks. Boom. Not a good way for the information to come out, right? In the middle of a big blowout. But it happens. All the time. Now, even when it does come out, I can't imagine any good way to get it out. Because parents, caregivers, even me, 20 years in the business, if I kick in and say blah, 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 I'm saying, geez, why would you tell it? How could it happen? It's only it up. Geez, I'm always in the house. The other problem is from the parent who's getting the information, and that speaks to that 1 in 5 thing, you know, why women don't support. They're like, how could this happen? Because if that was happening, it's a reflection upon the parenting of the other parent, the mother. First of all, I must be a bad parent and a bad person because I picked this guy. This is my intimate partner. And he's molesting my daughter. I would have known. And if I didn't know, it couldn't have happened. And if it did happen, then I must be culpable or responsible. I wasn't a good mom. I was asleep at the wheel. I wasn't paying good enough attention to my daughter. In the most fundamental way, she has breached her parental responsibility. It doesn't get any worse than that. There's nothing a parent can do that is more shameful, more impairing, more tragic than not protecting your daughter from being molested by your husband. So isn't it easier to declare your daughter a liar? Isn't it easier to think about this in terms of, I didn't make a mistake. She's just a snotty-mouthed teen. She's making it up. It can't be true. Because if it's true, it doesn't only speak to his deviancy, it speaks to her negligence. And the world is a better place if she's a liar than if she's telling the truth. Because if she's telling the truth, then mom was a bad mom and bad in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of reasons why, and I'm going to look forward to looking at your discussion boards on this issue, but there's a lot of domestic violence, reasons why moms don't always embrace the kids right away. In fact, when I argue to juries, I say to them, because, see, the defense lawyers want you to think that if the mom don't believe her, she's not worthy. And they'll imply that, they'll say that. The moms will testify for the guy sometimes. I mean, this lie, this embracing the perpetrator over their own daughter sometimes lasts through the trial for years. Sometimes they change their mind with therapy and watching the kid and talking to the kid. Sometimes they don't. But defense lawyers like to say or suggest, if she don't believe her, who knows her better than the mother? If she don't believe her, why should you? So the mother's feelings about it and how the mother responds are important. And what happens is, unfortunately, when it's delayed and unconvincing and you are rejected by your non-offending caregiver, when your siblings reject you, when the world around you rejects you and doesn't believe you or criticizes you or calls into question your behavior, all of the things, remember I said it's about weighing outcomes. You know, what's going to happen if I tell? If all of the horribles that you thought might happen, it's bad. So how do you make the world whole again? How do you bring peace back into the household? How do you go on living? Take it back. I heard you. Okay? Take it back. It's called recantation or retraction. Recantation or retraction. And, you know, what I like to say to juries is, if you think about it for a moment, I can't imagine a mother being any different when you first hear this. Now, unless you had like the Jane Doe mother or the reason to believe, because this happens in households where the moms, even good moms, don't know what the hell's going on. Now, in hindsight, you should have said, well, why did he always do this? Why was he an hour late? Why did I believe him when he said he was sleepwalking? Look, hindsight's 20/20, and sometimes, you know, there's some moms out there who say, gee, you should have known. But I cast, not anymore, I don't cast any aspersions on the mother. I get mad when a month later or 2 months later, they don't support their daughter, if the evidence is persuasive. You know, that's what troubles me. But I say to juries, I can't imagine it happening any other way. It is unusual for a mother to support their daughter and immediately reject their spouse as a molester. That makes no sense. Relationships, the man and the woman's relationships built on trust. Intimacy is built on trust. You've been intimate with this man for X number of years here. Okay? There's no one who knows him better than you. And to accept what your daughter says is to destroy everything you thought about this man year after year, week after week, and month after month. It can't be true. So there's not enough time to process this when it first comes out. I'd be shocked, and I tell juries, I'd be shocked if someone doesn't disbelieve their daughter at first. Now, there are mothers who, but see, it's not like I say, those mothers, they thought something. They knew he was creepy. They knew what he did in a prior life. They know how he thinks about girls, or how he hears at young girls. There's something in those moms who embrace their daughters. They've suspected something throughout the years. But to get, you know, shocked by this, to get punched in the stomach by this, to hear this for the first time and never having an inkling, most mothers will not believe it until they process it. So, chaos ensues. Their siblings are calling her a whore. The classmates at school are giggling and pointing a finger at her. Their mother doesn't believe them. The cops may not believe them. They may ask her questions. Well, why'd you do this? Why'd you do that? You know, those questions we talked about, the word lie, accusatory, all kind of things happen. The horrible outcomes that the child thought about begin to be real, so they take it back. They recant. Now, the research is all over the place. Anywhere between 8 and 25% of kids recant. I can spot it a mile away. You know, it's usually when the mother doesn't support them. And if the perpetrator's the primary breadwinner and they're living precariously and they don't have income other than his, and he's abusive, and all that stuff factors in. And you can see it coming a mile away. The kid recants. The good news is, among the kids who recant, if there is support, if that mother embraces them, eventually, within a week or 2, days, if that mother embraces them, and if they go to therapy and they process this, or someone supports that child, most kids who recant affirm. We call that affirming. They said it didn't happen, then they go back and say it really did happen. I just didn't want to see Dad go to jail. I was afraid he'd shut off the lights. I was afraid for Mom. I was afraid he'd kill me. I was, you know, they explain why. So out of the kids that recant, whether it's 8% or 22% or whatever it is, among those kids, if there is support, okay, if there is support from their mother eventually, or their siblings, or someone in their life, even a therapist that they connect with, they will affirm. They will go back and tell the truth again. And that's the good news. And that's a great day when that happens. Some kids recant forever. We try these cases, and we win almost every one of them with recanters. As long as we document their statements on video, or even in a statement. We're very successful with recanting kids. And they come in and they say it didn't happen, and we thank them, and they go away, and we introduce their statement to evidence. And then we introduce evidence that mom visited him in jail, evidence that he was the sole breadwinner. We put before the court all of the facts that made her life a living hell and point to recantation. And I talked about kids who lose trust, and I said, everyone, this is one I can say every, I can't say every a lot. Every child, every one of them who's been sexually abused by someone they love or trust, every one of them has issues with trust for the rest of their days. Some kids grow up into women and learn to cope, and they can be very successful, and the trust is not disrupted. The trust issues. Unfortunately, many of them, the trust issues are highly disruptive. And the ones that do well and don't wind up as roadkill, don't wind up addicted to drugs or engaging in self-harm or doing all kinds of other things, promiscuity, I guarantee you, if you were able to peek into their lives, they have someone that cares about them. Someone that believes them and has embraced them. The ones who have just one person, you only need one, just one. If you have one person to that kid who believes you, trusts you, and embraced you unconditionally, the prognosis is great. Unfortunately, many kids don't have that person, and they wind up with a lot of different issues growing up, and a lot of different issues with intimacy and members of the opposite sex. But not everybody is destined to that kind of life. Some kids survive. So we are going to have to push, like I said, I'm going to probably chop off that family violence lecture at the end. I will email everybody about how we're going to move forward. Obviously, we only got through half of this today. We need to talk more about experiencing abuse. So I'll slice and dice a little bit, and you'll hear from me about how we're going to move forward. Any questions about what we talked about today? All right. God willing, we'll see you here next Tuesday.